If modern history has shown us anything, it is how easily manipulable public sentiment is. And we typically look at this with dismay, but I pointed out back in 2005 in my book, Crafting Democracy, that this also opens the door to the possibility of positive narratives being used to imagine better futures instead of more fearful futures.
Welcome, everybody. This is Pascal again from Neutrality Studies, and I'm here one more time with Nicolai Petro, who's a professor at the University of Rhode Island and the author of The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classic Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution, to be published this month, December 2022. In this second part of the interview, we will be focusing on his new book, its arguments. And Nicolai, you're publishing this work at a very crucial moment when the war in Ukraine seems to have reached a fever pitch. Can you maybe, first of all, tell us about your book, what it is about, give us kind of the elevator pitch of the work?
I've been looking at the issues of conflict in Ukraine for more than a decade, and I couldn't find a good key that would explain the recurring themes that I was able to see in Ukrainian history over several decades. And as I began to look at them, it appeared to me more and more familiar to a book that I had read a while back, and that remains a classic, which is Richard Ned Libo's The Tragic View of Politics. And in his book, Libo looks at classical Greek tragedy as a mechanism for understanding international relations between states. And I thought that's all very well and good, but it seems to me also applicable to relations within states. And so that's what I set out to do with respect to Ukraine. So there's 6 chapters. The first chapter explores what tragedy is and its therapeutic function for societies that are in war and social conflict, because there's the easiest way, I think, to understand the Peloponnesian War is not as a war among differing societies, but rather as a war between the Greeks themselves, a family affair, if you will. And one of the things that the classical Greek tragedians tried to do in order to heal their societies was to remind themselves of the humanity of the other side, which in the course of war they are taught to hate, but then in the restoration of peace they have to learn compassion for as well. So that was the goal, broadly speaking, of classical Greek tragedy. And then I specifically explore different aspects of the current conflict in Ukraine, moving from the historical aspirations for independence for Ukraine, and then secondarily domestic policies that have been pursued in Ukraine since its independence, which were designed to cut off its very lucrative relationship with Russia on basically every level. And finally, to the latest conflicts after 2014 in Donbas and Crimea. And at the end, I asked the question of how this particular uh, is there a mechanism comparable to tragedy in the modern world that could also serve a therapeutic function? And I give the example of something that we perhaps should be looking at because it's been so successful in over 50 countries over the past 45 years, which is truth and reconciliation commissions. So that's what I have to offer in terms of my analysis of Ukrainian politics.
I would very much hope that vision comes true, because at the moment, I think the one thing we can agree on is that truth has been thrown under the bus. It's really, really hard to get any kind of reliable information from what is happening in and around Ukraine, and the level of propaganda on all sides has reached new levels, I believe. But in your book actually has 6 chapters, and in the latter part you focus on Crimea, the Donbas, the far right, and lastly what you call a flawed peace. And I would like to talk about those. Maybe let's start with the far right, because the far right is one of these issues that, especially in the West, is being portrayed as a Russian talking point. There are no Nazis in Ukraine. This is pure propaganda. But in your book, you're actually writing about the political influence the far right has had for decades. Can you maybe explain that a little bit, or what are the most important things to understand about far right politics in Ukraine?
Sure. So over the last decade, there have been at least 60 articles in major Western English language newspapers on the rise of the far right and neo-Nazi groups. Multiple articles in The Independent, Newsweek, The Guardian, Reuters, Associated Press, The Daily Beast, The Los Angeles Times, and The Nation, to name a few. In the Israeli press, multiple articles in the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, and the journal The Tablet. The issue of the rise of the far right was also flagged by Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, the Atlantic Council, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. These are not hard to find, and they are part of the historical record. My research in my book, along with that of the noted scholar, Ukrainian scholar Vladimir Ishchenko, now at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and Richard Sakwa, and Gordon Hahn and others, finds that the far right plays an outsized role in Ukrainian politics for 3 reasons. First, it provided the muscle and the organization for the 2014 Maidan ouster of then-President Yanukovych. Second, it had battle-ready troops ready and willing to fight in Donbas in 2014 and 2015 when the Ukrainian army initially would not. Third, it had a ready-made ideology of nationalism that could provide the country with a new unifying identity as being the antipode of Russia. And for all these reasons, a set of organizations which was and continues to be, outside of 3 regions of Western Ukraine, a marginal political force, plays a much larger ideological role and organizational role in the current Ukrainian government than their numbers would suggest, precisely because they're not organized merely as a political party, but as a political brotherhood whose objective is to transform the direction of the nation as a whole, really regardless of the political system. They're not that interested in the political system, but in having the clout and the ability to direct and make sure that the current direction, that the direction of the country remains true to the objective of a pure Ukrainian nation. That they thrive in the context of war. War makes them indispensable.
And they are very small, but they are very threatening to the political process. In the beginning of one of your chapters, you write that every new president of Ukraine sets out to be the peacemaker with Russia, and he ends up being a new incarnation of Stepan Bandera because they are pushed to the right by these little groups. Are you afraid that even somebody like Zielinski, President Zielinski, is actually threatened by them? I mean, would Mr. Zielinski be disposed if he went into a direction that is not in the interest of these ultra-right nationalist groups?
The quote you cite is actually one by the former Minister of Transportation, Emilian, who made that statement that it is inevitable that every Ukrainian president will turn out to be an enemy of Russia. I don't know whether the far right could politically remove the president, but that is an explicit threat that they have made continually, since their political leaders have made since 2014. Whether or not they have the capacity to do so, we don't know, but it is part of the rhetoric and part of the way in which they ensure the political loyalty of the regime.
Do you know how far the US and NATO is aware of this dynamic and whether they have an influence on this far right sector in Ukraine?
I assume that the United States government, and particularly the Department of Defense, as well as NATO institutions, are well informed about these organizations, because it would be impossible, I think, to interact with Ukrainian institutions, political and military, without running into contact with them. And certainly the military advisors that I've encountered, the Western military advisors, British military advisors that I've had the opportunity to encounter, were in contact with these organizations in order to ensure the effectiveness of their military mission. They are an integral part of the Ukrainian armed forces. So there's nothing not known, I think, to the West, both in terms of the direction and function of the far right in Ukraine. It is plausible to suggest that these are inconvenient bedfellows for Western Europeans, but a necessary evil, so to speak, and that they expect that as Ukraine becomes more independent, it will also become somehow more pluralistic and liberally minded, and that consequently the role of the far right would be reduced in Ukrainian politics. But that is something, I should say, that the far right is is aware of, that danger, and is doing everything in its power to ensure that that does not happen. And one of the things that I think is not very well understood in the West is that right now the far right's animus is directed at Russia. But in ideological terms, in terms of political pluralism, in terms of the kind of social acceptance of liberal values that are widely endorsed in the West, the far right is just as much an enemy of Western liberal thinking, including such things as specific minority rights for sexual minorities and other minorities. This is something that that the far right is vehemently opposed to.
You know, I wish I could say I've never heard of a situation where Western powers arm highly violent minority groups in a country that then eventually turn against them and blow up their World Trade Centers. I wish that hadn't happened before. I don't know why we keep doing this. This frustrates me beyond compare. But maybe let me move to my next question, because in chapter number 5 you talk about Crimea and the Tombas, and you ask this question: is there no escape from tragedy? What's your argument there, and how do you answer your own question at that point?
There is no permanent escape from tragedy, the Greeks argued, because it's part of our human nature. But that doesn't mean we cannot manage relations better. And part of managing the relationship and escaping the current tragic cycle and prolonging the distance between tragic cycles is to recognize what a tragic cycle is. So let me say a few words about that, because the answer to your question is essentially the way I describe tragedy and how it unfolds and how one escapes it. So every tragedy, I point out, is self-made. The resolution to it, therefore, lies in recognizing how we contributed to it, to our own tragedy, and therefore choosing to break ourselves the cycle of vengeance of which we are a part. And this is done through 3 steps. The first is the Greek word anagnorisis, which means recognition. Recognizing that recognizing tragedy means raising the public's awareness that the restoration of social harmony requires the efforts of the entire community, rather than one segment of it winning over or eradicating another part of the community. True harmony involves reaching out to those whom one is fighting. And in order to do this, we need to take the second step, which is catharsis. That is to say, to purge the soul of hatred so that confrontation, which is motivated by our hatred, can give way to true dialogue. And that's the ultimate step, dialogue, which is an attempt to actually evoke both compassion and forgiveness. The true objective of dialogue is self-transformation, which allows for the formation of a new relationship with the former enemy. So, classical, and therefore leads to social harmony. Classical Greek tragedy, therefore, is quintessentially a series of dialogues in which we are encouraged to expose our own tragic flaws, our own hatreds, to ourselves. Since only when participants grasp how much their own actions have stoked the hatred of others, can we choose a different path. So anagnorisis, catharsis, and dialogue ultimately lead to what the Greeks termed true justice. And true justice is rooted in compassion rather than false justice, which we often confuse with true justice, which is based on vengeance. So it's what you want to avoid is vengeance. And instead, what you want to aspire to is social harmony, which is based on these objectives of recognizing what you yourself did, self-examination, and then a dialogue building a new relationship.
So that this flows into the topic in the book of truth and reconciliation, right? I mean, I think it all flows into reconciliation. I had this talk with Anatol Lieven and Dimitri Trenin, and both of them were very, very sad, just sad beyond compare of what is happening. And they both said these wounds that are being inflicted now, they are going to last for decades. And this is going to be almost unbreachable. You seem to have another message to say that no, truth and reconciliation can be reached if the 3 steps are taken. Do you see, not just in abstract terms, but also in realistic terms, looking at Russian-Ukrainian history, that there is pragmatism somewhere in order to go forward and not to fall into the trap of vengeance?
If modern history has shown us anything, it is how easily manipulable public sentiment is. And we typically look at this with dismay, but I pointed out back in 2005 in my book, Crafting Democracy, that this also opens the door to the possibility of positive narratives being used to imagine better futures instead of more fearful futures. And it's very much the case that the politics that we embrace in any given generation is based on an image that we accept from the past, the one that we want to accept. And if we look at the past and emphasize our hatreds of others, then of course that will be replicated in our current policies. But if we look at the past and look at the hopeful and reconciliatory elements of our past history, then that too will be accentuated, and we will see greater opportunities for the future and for peaceful dialogue. There are many examples of this in history, perhaps most notably in the transformations that we have seen in recent times in relationships that truly were based on centuries of hate, like the relations between England and Ireland, or France and Germany, or in this country between the United States and Mexico. And yet today, of course, there are suspicions, and the relationship is perhaps not ideal, but we've certainly we've gone a long way from assuming that the two countries have to be perpetually at war with each other. So here's where I think classical Greek tragedy can serve a very useful purpose. Because as I stress throughout the book, Greek tragedy was therapeutic because it forced society to confront its own flaws. Now, I encountered the difficulty that there's no mechanism like the classical Greek Dionysia, which united the entire polis in a mandatory purging of its emotions twice a year. There's nothing that serves that function today. But when societies ultimately tire of warfare, there is a process that's been around for more than 45 years and that's been implemented in over 50 countries, known generally as truth and reconciliation. And in many ways, I argue, it is reminiscent of the Dionysia because it tries to bring about social reconciliation and heal deep social trauma. So I look in my final chapter at 3 examples of many, specifically the case of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, in Guatemala, and Spain, and argue that each one has something to teach Ukraine. South Africa, for the church's role in transforming a situation which was fraught with the potential for violent retribution into one of mutual forgiveness. In Guatemala, the ability to begin a national discussion of a very contentious history of over 30 year civil war, with the involvement, by the way, of external actors like the United States in their civil war, despite the government's reluctance to do so. And in Spain, there's the interesting example of the Pact of Forgetting. After 30 years of mandatory silence about the atrocities that were committed under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, the Spanish civil society eventually succeeded in giving birth to democratic institutions. But it was assessed right after Franco's death that a period of peace and calm needed to be enforced in society in order precisely for civil institutions to grow and assume a more significant role in society. And that has effectively happened. Now, Ukraine's solution will be its own, but there are many very useful examples to look at from the various Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I've highlighted just a few, the famous ones, but it seems to me that this is a very promising route to go through, precisely because there are so many unresolved, contentious disagreements within Ukrainian society. Without resolving those, I'm just afraid that any peaceful resolution of the current conflict will merely be an interlude before the next violent conflict erupts in Ukraine.
I pray for a solution or a way out that would lead to lasting peace. The last thing on earth we want is an ever-repeating cycle of violence flaring up and down. Nicolai, I have to let you go, but this has been a very interesting discussion. I encourage all of the viewers, please pick up a copy of Nicolai's book. It is out now. You can get it online, and it is highly insightful, and it is one of the rare works that doesn't only point out all of the bad things that are happening, but has an idea of how to go forward, a time-proven one. So I congratulate you to your book, Nicolai, and I hope to talk to you soon again.
Thank you very much, Pascal.